Wales.
In the 20th century, Australia held its own as a steel producer with a vibrant works in Newcastle, Port Kembla, which is still operating and waving the flag in that industry sector for New South Wales and Australia, and also in Whyalla. But of course, now we're hearing that Whyalla is in trouble. And you're entitled to wonder whether the dust will ever settle at Whyalla. The English entrepreneur at the centre of the last bailout has been given his marching orders. The administrators have taken over. And the federal government has announced that it'll be assisting the future owner to the tune of around $2.4 billion. What do you make of that, by the way? Is that a good investment? Do you think the idea of having steel production in Australia or manufacturing more broadly is worth the community paying whatever price is required? I thought we'd investigate that and what the future of Whyalla might look like. Will we have green steel ultimately, which was one of Mr. Gupta's dreams, of course? Daniel Rossetto is from the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources at the University of Adelaide and joins us now. Daniel, thanks for coming on. Good morning.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
Do we need a steel industry?
I think we need a steel industry. I believe that it's in Australia's long-term security interests to produce steel that we use in particular for defence forces. So I think that's really important and probably makes Whyalla a particularly high priority in that regard.
It seems like it's an imperfect market, though, doesn't it? If we've got to constantly bail out Whyalla, the market is speaking there, aren't they?
Yeah, I think there is an issue there that needs to be examined, and there are all sorts of other cost pressures that businesses in energy-intensive industries like steel are facing in Australia. I think we've got, over the last 15 or 20 years, a fairly poor track record in terms of being able to provide the steel industry with a consistent and understandable emission reduction framework. I think we've done quite poorly in that area, and that's had an impact as well on the certainty levels of making different investments in the steel industry. At the same time, Whyalla has been experiencing difficulties along the way, so there is definitely an issue there, and this is a good opportunity, I think, to try and understand and deal with those issues and put the industry onto a sustainable footing for the years that lie ahead, which are going to be very important.
Daniel, you mentioned Port Kembla, of course, and I imagine that BlueScope has got a million spreadsheets running at the moment trying to work out whether or not Whyalla is viable for them. Does it seem like a good marriage to you?
It potentially could be a good marriage. What one would need to analyse, though, is the degree of competition that is needed within Australia in the steel industry. So I think that's one that has to be examined very closely. BlueScope would clearly be, and I think it's already been indicated by some of the government people, that they are looking for interest from BlueScope. But yeah, I think we do have to have a look at what the competitive impact would be on the national landscape if BlueScope were to acquire the business in Whyalla. But at the same time, having a single owner dealing with both plants may have other advantages in terms of scale. So there are pluses and minuses with that, and they need to be, I think, investigated and understood very clearly before final decisions are made.
How challenging is this new tariff regime of Donald Trump and the Americans? I mentioned the spreadsheet. What sort of a risk factor do you have to apply in these circumstances?
For the Australian steel consumer, independent of any sovereign capability or defence industry impacts, if we looked at it just from the Australian steel consumer's point of view, it may actually be a positive, having the United States applying 25% tariffs across the board on steel imports, because if, as a lot of people talk about in the public domain, that there's an overcapacity in steel production globally, in which case they'll be aggressively looking for other markets into which they can sell, and that might result in some steel availability for Australia that wasn't previously there, and that could keep downward pressure on prices. So there's some potential advantages there, but of course that could then impact the investment outlook for steel production in Australia. So I think this is indirectly going to have a tremendous impact on the domestic steel industry. And there's also another really important matter is the way in which we deal with emissions regulations in Australia could also have an impact. There are impacts that could come from things like the safeguard mechanism and the proposed border carbon adjustment for Australia as well. So these things need to be well understood, and everyone needs to be clear on that before we start making the decisions about positioning the steel industry for the decades that come ahead.
I mentioned the numbers don't seem to be stacking up for the industry at the moment, and that certainly applies to green steel, doesn't it?
Yes.
Mr. Gupta was hoping to do that, and I would presume that it's the vast amount of investment that's required that's held back that concept. What do you make of developments there, and is there the potential that this rebirth in Whyalla could see green steel being produced there?
Yeah, I think green steel is an interesting one because, and I even wrote about this in a publication for The Conversation earlier in the week, where there isn't really a clear indication that the broader steel market globally is ready to pay a premium for green steel. And it's really something that's been developing a lot of interest over the last few years without there necessarily being evidence that the market's going to pay more for this type of steel. So unless the green steel comes about as a result of production efficiencies, then it's going to be a difficult one to say for sure whether we actually need green steel or not. What I think is much more important for Australia is that we get a stable emissions policy framework in place, one that is free of political change over the next 10 to 15 years, and we focus the domestic steel industry on working within that framework and complying and doing their best to meet the emissions reductions requirements of that, which might not necessarily be as ambitious as what some people have been talking about in terms of green steel, but it would certainly be a good start. And I think if Australia as a whole could achieve that level of stability, I think many of the problems relating to green steel that we've seen could be manageable.
Can energy production more broadly meet the ideological goals of zero emission? Is it just too hard for the sectors?
I think the idea behind net zero is, in principle, what scientific advice at least is suggesting needs to be done. But it's tremendously difficult to achieve when one thinks about the energy mix and the industrial base that the world has, but also in particular Australia. And we're talking about, transitioning to something. And I don't think there's been enough focus on economic modelling of the costs associated, certainly from the technologies that are available at the moment. That's a really big task. So I think maybe when it comes to net zero, there's been, or the public discussion has maybe got a little bit ahead of the feasibility of achieving that goal. So, yeah, I think this is a reasonable time to reset and to re-examine the proposition that we're going to achieve net zero by 2050, not because it's not a laudable objective, but because we need to be cognizant of the economic impacts of achieving that goal.
And just one final point, Daniel, your points earlier about sovereignty and defence would suggest that Australians would be more comfortable with Australian ownership of this rebranded Whyalla.
I mean, first thing we need to understand is how integral has Whyalla been in providing the steel that the defence industry needs in Australia. If we accept then that steel is a really important input for the sovereign capability of not just the defence industries, but the different industrial bases that produce for defence, Australia does need to ask itself whether it wants to be dependent upon other countries for vital inputs like steel. And in that respect, I think there does need to be some thought given to the role for Whyalla and the role for domestic steel production in general in an environment where there's a significant amount of geopolitical shifting going on around the world. We're seeing it in real time. And now is a very good time to re-examine the domestic steel industry and look at what is the key role that it could play in making sure we do have this sovereign capability, as people refer to. And I think we need to be more specific about defining exactly what sovereign capability we want for Australia.
Daniel Rossetto, thank you so much.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you.
Daniel is from the Institute for Sustainability, Energy and Resources at the University of Adelaide, just down the road from the Whyalla Steelworks, which is the subject of our conversation today. Thanks to John from Armidale, who says, Paul, yes, we definitely need a local steel industry. Unfortunately, union demands, inefficiencies, high wages, not building LEHE, coal-fired systems, that's the newer technology, power stations, and steel-making capability decades ago has led to us sending our iron ore and coal overseas, and then we import less high-quality steel back to Australia, which is cheaper than steel we manufacture here. Go figure, says John today. 0487991233 if you'd like to tell us anything as well. 10:22. Do not adjust your clocks.